Hello everyone and welcome back to the Second Party Podcast. Recently on Twitter, I was replying to someone I follow who had asked about kind of the main reason why people are believers, why people are Christians. And I had replied with a couple of different things. One of them I was kind of taking a philosophical viewpoint, and the other side I was kind of speaking a little bit from experience. And somebody followed up asking about, other faiths and what exactly Christianity had as a differentiating factor.
Why you see Christianity specifically as more likely to be true than any other type of religious faith.
Yeah.
Right.
And I thought that was a really good question, so I wanted to...
And it's an important question, too.
Yeah, it is.
Because it's
very
one thing to
question.
come to the conclusion that, okay, yeah, I think God exists.
Yeah.
But it's a completely different thing to figure out what you think that means. Which God of all these different ideas of God is the God?
Yeah.
That's probably a more important question.
Yeah, I think so. And, a lot of people say, oh, well, every religion really is just saying the same kind of thing, or they're the same kind of core tenets and everything. And while I think that is maybe true to a degree, right? There are certain tenets in most religions that are similar across them. Hey, don't steal in general. Don't kill. Don't murder people in general. Don't steal in general. Stuff like that. I think that Christianity is highly unique, and there are a couple of different ways that I think makes it unique and as such makes it true.
Over any other religion.
Yeah, over other religions. I think we'll dive into some of these things in maybe a more well-articulated manner, right? Each thing kind of individually, maybe at a later date. But I think it's good to kind of at a high level talk about some of these things, flesh out some of those ideas, and give a general answer, right? And then if somebody was more curious about a particular aspect of it, I want to try and flesh that out a little bit further at a later date.
Yeah, so setting the premise of what this episode is going to be, right, is you or we are going to run through a handful of reasons why you specifically believe Christianity to be true.
Why I personally do, yeah.
Yes. And it's not going to be some kind of super polished argumentative structure of this. It's going to be kind of casual and lighthearted, talking based on personal experience and kind of where your mind is at and the things that for you personally have led you to believe this to be true.
Yeah, I don't mean this to be the most amazing, compelling argument to everyone always. This is just kind of
it's not even necessarily meant to
it.
be like a persuasive essay kind of thing. It's not meant to be persuasive. It's meant to share what for you has convinced you. Right?
Yeah, I'd say it's more of what I personally find compelling, right? Everyone finds something different compelling. I've heard so many stories where someone will mention, oh, and this is really the thing that just like made me realize. And I kind of think to myself, really? That was the thing? I mean, I'm happy for you, but I'm so surprised that was the thing, because it wouldn't have been that way for me at all.
Sure.
So everyone's different. So these are, just some of the things that I find unique that make Christianity true above other religions. So I think the first thing that I tried to outline a bit in my response was kind of the philosophical side of things. And obviously, I think pretty much everyone from all walks of faith can recognize that the unique aspect of Christianity at its core is Christ. Right? That's why Christianity is named what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are two things that Christ brings to the table that are unique, that really speak to me personally. The first is how Christianity addresses sin. Right? So when we're talking about comparing these different religions, right, we've accepted, let's say, a general premise of like God exists, right? And
some kind of supernatural creator deity, right?
yeah, well,
Is that foundational to all religions?
not all,
Like
no, but most.
Buddhism?
Not all, but most. Most of the major world religions have some creative God who's highly, highly powerful. Okay? So once you're past that, and you have this perfect God who dictates what is or isn't true in the universe, right? And dictates what is or isn't right and wrong. I think ultimately you arrive at a conclusion that each person falls short of being literally perfect, right? Which is what God is.
That there's some standard that you can look up at, some ideal that you can look up at and strive towards, but never exactly reach perfectly, right?
Yeah. And I think that's, I'm sure people will disagree with that, but I do think that that's a relatively common thing that is seen across many of the major world religions.
I think you'd have to be pretty prideful to recognize that there is that ideal standard, but not be able to recognize that you are not there.
Sure. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Or that you can't be there.
Yeah, I agree. So now we've established that God is perfect and created us, and we fall short of his perfection. Right?
Well, we've established that there's a gap between God, the ideal, the perfect, and us, humans, that we really can't bridge.
Yeah. And I think it's at this point that you really see the differentiation between various world religions, right? How do we address that gap? Let's refer to it as like the gap of sin, okay? Because that's a word that'll be used across various religions, okay? So how do we reconcile between those 2 points? God's perfection and our imperfection.
Yes, and that's an important question that I think everyone has to ask, because the answer to that question determines what basically the purpose or the aim of your life is.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah. So a lot of the world religions attempt to address that gap by saying, well, there are certain things that you need to do. There are certain things that you need to adhere to, certain actions that you take to be good to make up that gap of bad. Right?
Or to be good enough to where you can still be accepted.
Yeah. I think the biggest issue that I see with that is when you have that divide between perfect and imperfect, that divide is not a finite gap, right? Infinity minus some finite number is still an infinite amount, okay? Similarly, the gap between God's infinite perfection and our imperfection is infinite. So we can't bridge an infinite gap in our own finitude. We can't do enough finite good things to make up for that infinite gap.
Because we are finite, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One way I like to think about this is if you're looking at a car, okay? The person who made the car defines what the car is to do, good and bad, right?
What do you mean what the car is to do?
What the purpose of the car is, what the goal of the car is.
Like whether that be racing or
Yeah. Or commuting or whatever. I mean,
okay.
that's true with anyone who creates anything. If I make a chair, I define what the end goal of said chair is.
Okay.
God does the same with us. And a car can't fix itself when it breaks down to get back on the road, to continue to do the greatness that the builder intended. The builder needs to step in to fix the car. Another way that I kind of think about this, because we oftentimes, on the Christian side of things, talk about sin as a debt that needs to be paid. And the reason that we talk about it in that fashion is we have a duty. Just like a car has something that it is to do, we have something that we are to do.
Something we were made to do.
Yes.
We were meant for, just like a car was meant for a specific purpose.
Yeah. And when we come up short, when we don't perform that duty, that differential creates some kind of debt. And one way that I conceive of the debt, and we've kind of talked about this before, is let's say I lend my sister something. Okay? And she breaks that thing. Right? God has given us so much, and we've come up short with that. Just like when my sister has broken something, something needs to be done about that to make things right again, to make things whole again. Either A, she pays me for those headphones that she broke, or I forgive her. Right? And we see this nowadays with the talks about student loan forgiveness. Forgiveness of debt still has to come from somewhere. You can't just snap your fingers and make it go away. Somebody foots the bill. In the case of student loan forgiveness, taxpayers foot the bill. In the case of me forgiving my sister for breaking my headphones, I'm footing the bill because I'm out headphones, or if I have to buy headphones, I'm out whatever the value of said headphones were. So now we've established that our coming up short, our imperfection, which we all have, creates an infinite divide between us and God, a debt that we cannot pay.
But has to be paid somehow.
And it must be paid. And when I say that it must be paid, I don't mean in an imposed sense of things. I mean it from a natural cause standpoint. When something is broken, value is lost. Okay? It's not as if there is some court that orders something and they could just wave their hand and make it go away. That's not how reality works. Mm-hmm. Similarly, when we sin, it needs to be reconciled. It needs to be paid in some capacity. So then you ask the question, well, what does that look like? What does paying that debt look like? And I think you can conceptualize this in a variety of different ways, but what Christianity asserts is that Jesus is the embodiment of that. And you can think about this in a variety of different ways. You can think about it as, Jesus taking on the sins of everyone and dying, right? You can think about it as, right, Jesus suffering because Jesus is God, that being the difficult thing that's being overcome. That's how God is paying that when he forgives. So when I forgive my sister for destroying my headphones, let's say I don't go buy new headphones. I'm out that pair of headphones. That hurts me. Or let's say I go and I buy another pair of headphones. I've lost money now. Jesus dying on the cross is a literal representation of the debt that God is paying for us. It's the embodiment of that suffering. By contrast, I think most other religions try and bridge that gap with something finite. And I don't think that makes sense to me.
Well, it's like it's not adequate, right?
Yeah. It's always going to come up short.
If we're talking about this philosophically, right, it's not an adequate payment. Christianity says the wages of sin is death. And that makes sense to me because if there's something evil and there's a perfect God who part of being perfect would be eliminating anything evil, right? Bringing justice and eliminating evil. Otherwise, you're not perfect. If you don't care to eliminate evil, you're not good.
Mm-hmm.
right? So embedded in the premise of who God is that he must eliminate evil. How do you do that? If you have evil things, how do you get rid of it? Not just temporarily, not just a band-aid fix, but for good. It has to die. So
Yeah.
that's how I think about, like, the wages of sin is death. That's why there has to be a death, right? And so
Yeah.
if death is what we owe, right, there are two options. We can pay that debt and just die,
Mm-hmm.
I guess. But then, okay, we've paid our debt, we're at equal standing, but now, like, we're dead. And I don't mean, oh, dead, but great, now we get resurrected and in heaven. I'm saying we're dead. We're gone forever. We don't exist. We've been eliminated.
Yeah.
Because we can pay our debt and nothing more. There's nothing left of us. It's everything.
Yeah.
So if we can't pay that, or we could, but we would just die and be nothing, clearly that's not how God intended this to happen, because we exist. And if what we were meant to do is just die and seize into nothingness, I don't think a perfect God would have created anything in the first place. So obviously there has to be another plan, and that's why there has to be God himself dying in our place, because only he can pay that debt, but not have that debt consume himself as well, because he did not sin and did not deserve that death.
Yeah, I think a similar way that I kind of conceptualize this is, I feel like when we die, C.S. Lewis has a great quote. There are two types of people when they die: those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and those to whom God says, "Thy will be done." Right? And I think what that exemplifies is, like, you get to choose whether you ally yourself with the good or the bad, whether you identify yourself with the good or the bad. And at the end of the day, God will eliminate evil. If you have anchored yourself, if you have identified or are unwilling to let go of evil, it's kind of like at the end of The Lord of the Rings, where Smeagol is diving after the ring. He burns up and dies with the ring because he's allied himself with it so much. If you're willing to divorce yourself from that and ally yourself instead with God, manifest physically in Jesus, then the evil part of you gets burned up, it goes away, it dies, but you're still there. And I think, this kind of brings us into the second part of the philosophical side of Christianity that I think is unique and makes it true. And that's the emphasis on the physical. I oftentimes dub this like physical unification, or kind of reuniting like mind and body, because a lot of religions have a moment where you die and, your spirit goes up into this mystical spirit realm, which is heaven, where you get to live in bliss. But that's not what the Bible teaches. What the Bible teaches is that when Jesus comes back, there is heaven on earth.
A new earth.
There's a new earth ruled by Jesus. And on that new earth, we are given new bodies. And Jesus comes down. God is made flesh with us. And this serious emphasis on the physical, on keeping our souls, our minds, and our bodies as things that must necessarily all coexist together, I think this is something that is highly unique to Christianity. When I look at other religions, I oftentimes see a conclusion, or at least a rational conclusion that one could draw as, well, this life just doesn't matter, because at the end of it, like, all of this is just physical, right? Kind of like the hippy dippy, it's all just physical, man, mind over matter. And in my experience, that is not something that makes sense to me in any capacity. I think what makes far more sense is that you can't have your mind and your body divorced. And this is something
Well,
that
that's dualism, right?
yeah,
It's this idea that these are two kind of separate, distinct, opposite forces that are competing against each other. And there's a great book called Love Thy Body by Nancy Pearcey, but she talks about that and all the different implications of that in, modern society and everything. But this idea of dualism that separates the physical from the spiritual and puts them kind of at odds with each other.
yeah, and I think that's a great point to highlight. Like, when we say, oh, well, like the physical doesn't matter, to me, that's a denial of reality itself almost. When you start emphasizing or dividing mind and spirit from body, to me, I ask the question, how can you test, how can you understand whether something is true or not? Because part of the way that I understand whether something is true or not is by asking myself whether or not something is functional, right? So if I think, oh, I can walk on water, and then I try and walk on water and I sink, well, obviously I can't walk on water. And this is in part what the scientific method is founded upon.
Mm-hmm.
So when I see many religions dividing the spiritual from the physical, it seems to be something that flies in the face of everything that has made sense or worked throughout human history. And if these two are just wholly separate, then why does any of this matter?
Right. That's what I come to. That's what I come to as well. Like, if the physical is not important or is itself evil, like, the first and second century Gnosticism taught in the early Christian church, which is one of the first broad, like, heretical movements that came about in Christianity, which essentially said that the material world is evil.
Yeah.
And that God only came to Jesus, like, as a spirit, but Jesus, the physical person, was an evil, like, entity in a sense, because the physical world is evil. That's how I understand what Gnosticism was, at least. But I think what that fails to explain is, why does the physical world exist? It's like,
Yeah.
we've talked about this before, but the fact that you exist, the fact that you are here, a conscious being with a physical body that you can experience, is evidence that you are here for a reason and there's a purpose for your existence. And
Yeah.
anything other than that is nihilism. And so I think if you're saying the material world is evil, or it doesn't matter, or it's something to be completely rid of, and we need to just focus on spiritual elevation and achieving spiritual fulfillment and leaving the physical for good, that fails to account for why the physical world exists in the first place, from a philosophical standpoint, I think.
Well, I think the other thing I'd say is, where do we see these two separate? Where do you see some mind, some spirit, some something that isn't embodied? Like, where does some mind exist devoid of a body? Like, you can't separate hardware from software. Software doesn't exist without hardware to run it on. And hardware is worthless without software
Right.
to do something with it.
It's like the two must work in unison with each other. They must be. They have to be working in harmony, the spiritual and the physical. Otherwise, it doesn't really make sense to me.
Yeah, and I don't see evidence to the contrary. So then, to me, this would beg the question, if the physical is something critical, would it not stand to reason then that God and that paying of the debt for us humans is also something physical, something tangible?
Right. Like it's
Because
not.
otherwise you have like, and I don't mean to like mischaracterize this, so I'm sorry if this isn't like the best phrasing, but my understanding is that like the Jews also believe that like sins are forgiven, but that God just forgives them.
Well, and they believe in like the idea of like the Messiah. Obviously, they have all the Old Testament, all these prophecies about the Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they believe in this concept of a messianic type figure, but they don't believe in that being literally embodied in Christ. And I think that's the critical issue there, is that it can't be just an idea or a concept. It
Yeah.
has to be a literal, historical, material thing that happened.
Yeah, and I guess I just think from like from a very broad standpoint, when I see people employ the mentality that spiritual, mental can be divorced from hardware, software, physical. When somebody employs that mentality, we end up with things that don't make sense, with things that don't work. Okay? You look at things like a perfect modern example is that of like transgenderism. This idea that, oh well, your mind can be one thing and your body can be another. They're totally separate. They're divorced. There was an error.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? That mentality functionally doesn't work. And I think then you flip it around and you ask yourself like, okay, well what happens if we do adopt the mentality that I'm asserting? That these are unable to be divided, that they're one and the same. Every time where I see that, there is a logical, productive conclusion when compared to its counterpart. So let's say, for example, I've been using the terms like hardware and software, right? That's more of like the computer side of things. But when I look at like hardware and software companies, two great examples, and maybe this is slightly changing going into the future, but if you look at, a few years back, look at like Microsoft versus Apple, right? On the Microsoft side, they're designing Windows to run on a ton of different hardware. Same thing with Android. And the level of efficiency, whether you appreciate one or the other, the level of efficiency has drastically gone down. You compare that then to the Apple and Mac OS side of things, where Mac OS or iOS is designed for that specific device. They're trying to pull the hardware and the software and bring them as close together as they can.
They're designed with the other in mind. They're
Yes.
designed together. They're meant to go together.
And because of that, you have insane levels of efficiency, insane levels of ability to utilize resources. Now, you don't have to love one of these companies or the other. I'm not making any assertion about that. But I'm using this as an example for a way that this mentality functionally works, how it manifests in a productive fashion. And I think that the same thing is true when we're speaking spiritually.
Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the essence of what you're saying here with these first couple points that you've made is Christianity offers an answer to A, how that gap of sin can be effectively addressed,
Mm-hmm.
and B, what the purpose of the physical world is, which we clearly and undeniably experience.
Mm-hmm.
And it answers those two things philosophically in a way that you would say no other religion does or can. And for that reason, philosophically, it makes the most sense.
Yeah,
Right?
and I guess I would add that both of those are exemplified and made manifest in the person of Jesus Christ.
Right. Very specifically.
Yes. So that's kind of the philosophical side. And then obviously, like, I think for anything that someone believes, There's a philosophical side, and then there's kind of an experiential side, right? Because once you start believing something, that changes how you act in some capacity. So I have personal experiences that also factor into why I think that Christianity is correct and unique in that way. And I characterize this in kind of a general nature on the thread. And I'll go into some examples, but I said, like, and maybe this is odd, maybe some other Christians will kind of balk at this, but when I was coming to know Christ, there was kind of part of me that didn't want Christianity to be true. And part of the reason for that was there were things that I didn't want to have to do or have to believe or have to follow. And in that way, like kind of initially, other religions were more attractive. And yet, despite this, I ended up finding Christianity to be more true when implemented than other religions. Like many things that I thought would make logical sense with other religions didn't end up working how I thought that they would. They weren't productive. And plenty of things that didn't make sense with Christianity to me seemed to yield like very positive results, despite me not thinking that they would.
Okay, like what?
Sure. So,
what things did you quote unquote try from other religions?
okay, sure. So, I think, there are a number of different things. In many religions, there's an emphasis on like kind of self-improvement, right? You see this in like kind of the modern stuff, but there are also aspects of this in other religions as well, where you're sitting here and you're thinking about how you can be better or what you could do better, and
you have a sense of control over your own self-improvement in a sense, right?
yeah,
control over your own destiny, kind of.
yeah. And I think most of those other religions say that, well, when you're focusing on yourself, when you're trying to self-improve, that's what's going to make you happy, right? You especially see this with the like kind of modern secular type of religion, as I would characterize
New
it.
Agey stuff.
Yeah, where people just go, oh, you just gotta love yourself, and you just gotta love yourself, treat yourself, right? Fat pride, stuff like that. Okay, and I found that as I like was focusing on myself more and more, and I was thinking about, okay, like what could I do here, or like, yeah, I'm doing great at this, right? Hyping myself up. I found myself not becoming happier, not becoming more joyous, not becoming more content, but slowly becoming more and more unhappy and more depressed with things. And that's kind of what I was talking about from like a counterintuitive standpoint. You would think, oh yeah, man, the more I think about myself, the more I'm focusing on me, like the happier that I'm going to be. And Christianity says the exact opposite. C.S. Lewis, when he's talking about selflessness, because it's a big thing in the Bible, talks about selflessness not being something where you're denigrating yourself, thinking less of yourself, but rather something where you are thinking about yourself less frequently. And I found that as I tried to orient myself towards others more and not be as concerned with myself or my wants or my own well-being, that I became a much more content and joyous individual. I found that as I gave more of myself and focused on myself less, that I was happier. So that was kind of the first thing. Another thing that I really realized was praying for those who persecute you. Most ideologies say that if someone's your enemy, you want to be against them at all times, right? You want like bad things to happen to them, and you want good things to happen to you.
Well, that's what comes natural to human nature, right?
Yeah.
Putting yourself at odds with enemies and a struggle between each other.
Yeah, right. The eye for an eye.
Yeah.
That type of thing. And I found myself, as I put myself at odds with others, becoming more bitter, becoming less happy, and becoming far less content. And by contrast, then when I prayed for those who persecute, or prayed for those who are persecuting me, I found myself again more content, less bitter, and having better relationships with everyone, not just those who were persecuting me. Like I experienced a lot of, I don't know that I would necessarily call it like bullying, because it's a very like kind of cliche word, I think. But I experienced a lot of people just like needlessly being kind of mean to me in like middle and high school, especially.
Yeah. People. Well, I remember I was
like
there. I can attest to
Okay,
this.
is it fair for me to say uniquely so?
Oh yeah, you were like, people were really kind of vicious to you. I don't really know why. I hope that I wasn't. This was kind of before we were really friends or anything, but yeah, it was like you were 100% just kind of the joke of our grade at our small school, and a bunch of people had determined that, and it was weird. And we were like looking through your yearbook once, some yearbooks from back then, reading comments, like people sign yearbooks at the end of the year, and there were like only a couple of actually genuinely nice or kind comments. A lot of them, I think people played it off as like a joking, teasing thing, but it was excessive, and it was very heavily directed at you specifically, and I don't really know why that was, but yes, I can attest for what you're saying.
Okay. Well, I guess anyway, I experienced a lot of that in middle and high school, and like I said, I found myself really embittered for a long time about that. But as I began to like legitimately pray for people who were being like rude or mean to me, I found myself just in a much better mental state, to where it really didn't bother me.
Yeah, you never like lashed out back at people. You were always just kind of pretty chill and mellow about it, I think.
Yeah, I mean it was tough really early on, but
at least from what I saw, I should say.
But like I'm really not meaning it to be like a cliche, but I legitimately got through it by like praying for those people. And like we'll probably talk about prayer more like at a later date, but I do believe that a big component of prayer is transforming our own hearts and orienting ourselves toward God. And I think that is part of what God helped me with through that.
So, I mean, some of these things, I think, depending on what you're classifying as a religion, there definitely are other religions that have these as tenets too, right? Like being selfless and
yeah, sure.
Being, it's not like no other religion has those values. I don't think that's what you're trying to say at all.
No.
Like being kind and selfless and loving your enemy, that kind of thing. I mean, some in modern society, if we're talking about new agey, like secularism kind of, for sure, it's not really like that. But I don't know a lot about like Islam, for example. I don't really know.
Well, I think the culmination of all of these things is
Hinduism.
not something like highly observed in other religions, in other non-Christian religions.
No, I mean you're kind of building a cumulative thing. I'm just saying that I think a disclaimer is,
sure.
I don't think you're saying that no other religion says you need to be selfless. Like
no,
certainly there are others.
Of course,
right?
Of course.
Like we talked about at the beginning, there are basic tenets that a lot of religions kind of agree on. Moral tenets, I should say. But
yeah.
I just thought maybe that should be a little disclaimer.
No, that's a good disclaimer. Another thing that I guess really made me lean into Christianity is suffering. Like I've talked about this on a few other podcasts and stuff, but kind of around that same point that I was referencing before, when I was getting, I don't know, like, tease a lot was I was experiencing two main things, again, that I've like kind of talked about on the podcast before, but one was having like a lot of stomach issues. Like I was literally out of school for like a month straight because I was just constantly, perpetually sick. And then a bit later on, I had unbelievably severe cystic acne to the point where, like, and I've talked about this on Twitter before, but I went on Accutane for like a long time at a very high dosage. And like, I'm very blessed that that worked and was very helpful. But through both of those things at that point in my life, especially as like, you know, an impressionable teenager, a middle schooler, a high schooler, I felt like I was suffering a lot. And, you know, I'm not at all saying that I suffered more than anyone else. Like, there are plenty of people who suffered far more than I did, and I'm sure plenty of people who suffered far less. I'm not saying that I'm unique in that aspect, but it was through that suffering that the unique nature of Christianity, that Jesus, God, came down and endured the suffering like what I was going through.
Probably worse.
Well, yeah, yeah, but I'm saying like he suffered in that way. He was human.
Yeah.
Okay? That was like so wholly unique, and
yeah,
that just it really spoke to me, because how can you have this God who relates to people, who loves people, who is personable to people, who hasn't had that experience?
Yeah, and that is something that I do believe is unique to Christianity, different than any other religion, is that our God is not one who is all separate and distant,
yeah, like ruling up from on high,
our pain and suffering. It's like he's a God who literally became like, imagine becoming a gnat, right?
Yeah.
He became a baby, a human baby, and endured temptation and pain and suffering and torture and execution and these things. Like, we don't have a God who can't relate to our suffering.
Yeah.
And that makes a lot of sense to me if we're talking about a God who is truly perfect and loving.
Yeah. And I think, you know, I've been comparing this a few times to like the Jewish side of things. I'm doing that because that's honestly probably what I know like second most out of the world religions. But in the Old Testament, God is not like walking around amongst the people. He is portrayed as this like ruler from on high.
Yeah.
Right? If you touch the Ark of the Covenant, right, like people are dying.
Yeah.
And
he was inaccessible, like, you know, the tabernacle and the veil that covered the most holy inner place. God was kind of separate and inaccessible. He was
inaccessible, but
whatever. Inaccessible to us.
I think you see that with a lot of different world religions, and I truly think that like Christianity is an unbelievably unique example. God came down. God suffered like the most that like anyone's going to suffer. He gets that. When you're sitting here and you're thinking, oh man, I broke my arm, like, oh, God doesn't understand. Like, really? He died on a cross, dude. Like, so I don't know, that from a personal level really spoke to me, and was something that I realized as like kind of testing things. And then the last thing, and this is kind of like this was by far and away the biggest thing for me, and I know that people are probably gonna kind of like balk or laugh at this because it's always the thing that people seem to like dread in church. But the thing that finally like really pushed it over the line for me was tithing. And we'll probably dive into this more at a later date, but the Bible says a few things about tithing. One of them is Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also.
It's indirectly about tithing, I guess. But
Okay.
yeah.
Well,
You can apply the principle.
yeah.
That's the principle of why you give like the first fruits to God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's
Do we
one.
need to define tithing really quick?
Okay, yeah. Tithing is where you're giving 10%. And I guess when I'm using it in this context, I'm saying at least 10% that you're giving.
Tithe means tenth.
Yes.
And the idea that comes all the way back, into the Old Testament is that the people would give the first 10% of everything they had, or the best 10%, back to God, sacrifice it to him, give it to, in Old Testament Israel, the priests at the temple. That's where the first 10% would go. It would all go towards back to God as an offering. And it was important that it was the first, because it's not like you would use what you had and then get to the end and here's the scraps that I can give. It's you get everything in for the year, all your grains or your cattle or whatever it is, and the best 10%, you're just giving it up before you even touch any of the rest.
Yeah.
So in modern day, when we're talking about tithing and like the modern church, it's giving 10% of what you make, your money, to the church.
Yeah.
And not whatever you have left after your monthly expenses. It's like the first thing you do with every paycheck, 10% goes to the church.
Yeah.
Right, that's what we're talking about with tithe.
Yeah. And I think this has been said a bunch of different ways, but tithing really isn't for like the church, and it's not for God. Tithing is for us.
I mean, it is for the church in the sense that that's how churches operate and run, because churches are funded by donations of the congregation. But on a spiritual level,
yeah, I'm speaking spiritually.
Right. It's not for this organization, and obviously God doesn't need our money.
Yeah.
So,
that's why I'm trying to get at. God doesn't need that.
Just like God doesn't need the first 10 sheep, that the Israelites produced in the year or whatever. He doesn't need that.
Yeah.
It's not for him, it's actually for your heart.
Yeah. And I think for me, I am an unbelievably fiscally conservative person. And
that's an understatement. Yeah.
And I remember like asking myself this question, like, if I'm going to stake my life on Christ, why can't you stake 10% of your money? Like, that's nothing in comparison.
Well, and with the tithe, like, this is another one of those things where it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and
right, if you're looking at the numbers.
Yeah, why would my life be better with 10% less?
Even better financially.
Yeah.
Like, why would you, which I really believe that a lot, if you talk to the vast majority of faithful Christians who tithe regularly and have for a long time, they would say they are better off financially than if they were not tithing. And that makes no sense.
Well, I mean, it's that's a
right?
reported statistic, but I agree. I, in my own life, have seen, like I'm really not trying to come across like braggadocious or anything here, but I'm very, very happy and blessed in my life, and my life got significantly better, like orders of magnitude better, after I started tithing. And I really think that when God says, like, test me in this, in the Bible, like it's basically the only time where God says that we should test him in something.
That is in the book of Malachi. Yes.
Okay.
Malachi 3:10, I believe.
That, like, he means that. And when I did that, I saw the results, and that's an understatement for me. And
yeah, and that's
I think when you do that, and the Bible says, like, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Like, it also furthers your relationship with God, because you're putting that stake on that, right? You're buying in. You're saying like, no, this really does matter to me, and
And
like
money, it's
I'm
so easy for money to become an idol too,
yeah,
that when you decide ahead of time that you're not going to let it be. And I'm not saying you can't be someone who tithes but still not be looking at money as an idol, but it is this thing of deciding where your money is going first,
mm-hmm.
not just literally, but in a spiritual and emotional sense.
Well, and
Any
that puts God first then too. If the first thing I'm doing with my money is like it's going to God.
mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like I'm not going to go into details here, but I've experienced things like that similarly where I was at a point in my life, like when I was in college, and I decided I was really going to start tithing, and I did. Just correlated with some very significant things in my life that changed that yeah, you could sit here and you can say this is a coincidence, and I'm not expecting that to be convincing to anybody else,
Mm-hmm.
but for me as a personal factor in my own confidence and conviction, it's not something that I can deny. I think that's the same for you,
Yeah,
right?
I think this is like, illustrated well with a quote from Howard Dayton, who's a pastor and author. He says, "When we acknowledge God's ownership, every spending decision becomes a spiritual decision. No longer do we ask, 'Lord, what do you want me to do with my money?' The question is restated, 'Lord, what do you want me to do with your money?'" And I think when we come to that realization that like none of this is ours, giving 10% and having that buy-in into like putting something on the line for our relationship with God, I feel like it calls you into something deeper. And like if there was someone who was struggling with like faith with taking that leap, I think that might be the first thing that I would advise. And I take that very seriously because like that's a very serious time in someone's life. So I'm not haphazardly saying, or asserting that piece of advice. I legitimately think that like if you're sitting here and you're like, I'm struggling with faith, like I'm on the edge, but I think tithing, that is the first thing that you should go to personally. And it made a massive difference in my life and continues to. And I'm not saying that this is some, I don't want this to be characterized as like some prosperity gospel, like, oh, if you sow this seed and you give to God, then everything's going to go amazing in your life. Like, no, the Bible says that we'll face many trials and we're going to suffer. Not everything's perfect, but I am so much better off for that, and I'm so happy that I did that, and that is probably like the biggest experiential thing.
Like the biggest personal reason for you why you are personally convinced that Christianity is true because of that
The,
on
experientially.
a personal experience
Yeah.
side. Yeah.
Yeah, that is such a blatant, straightforward, obvious thing in my life that's undeniable for me. And I know that like not everyone's going to relate to that obviously, but that's the advice that I would give to someone who's kind of on the edge there. And those are the reasons why I think Christianity is uniquely true compared to other religions, both experientially and philosophically.
Man, and you didn't even get into any of the maybe like historical art slash archaeological evidence for Christianity or the explosion of Christianity or Jesus's life and resurrection and everything. Were those not really huge influences in you, in your coming to faith, personally?
Well, I mean, I'm not saying that they don't matter. I'm not saying that at all. Like, obviously, it's critical and it does matter.
I know. I'm just saying
But
we're talking about what for you personally has convinced you that Christianity is true, and you haven't mentioned any of those. So my question is, were those just not super influential for you in personally coming to that conclusion? Even though I believe that there is a lot of evidence there.
I I'm sure they had a level of influence, but less than all of the other things that I mentioned,
Okay.
or less than all of the other philosophical things.
Okay.
And like I want to emphasize, like, I'm sure that many believers would listen to this and kind of have a reaction like you, where you're like, really, those things? But that's
Well,
kind of why I started. I said these are the things that really, for me, stand out.
yeah. Right, and that I know, and I get that. I'm just saying, like, I think those are maybe honorable mentions.
Sure.
I guess of
Yeah, I don't disagree.
I think a very strong argument can be made that we're not going to go into this and try to make this argument right now, but I think a strong argument can be made that Christianity is unique above all the other religions in its like historical evidence for it, for talking about the resurrection of Jesus
Yeah,
and the
certainly.
explosion of Christianity in the first century and the sheer number of biblical archaeological, what's the word I'm looking for?
Historical,
Uh,
archaeological.
Biblical accounts
Oh,
that we have,
yeah, yeah.
right? The Gospels and how quickly they were written, like from an archaeological standpoint, how close the Gospels and Christianity came to be developed to that historical event of, when Jesus was on the earth is unprecedented among archaeology. And I don't think any
Yeah,
other religion has something like that backing it up. So I would
yeah.
say that is maybe another thing that is certainly unique to Christianity.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of those points, I think books like The Case for Christ, those are really good resources that help outline some of those more historical or general points, I would say. For me though, obviously those like play a role, and I believe that to be the case, but the things that were the most compelling to me were what I outlined.
Sure.
And I hope that maybe somebody listens to that and they're more similar to me and they go, yeah, some of those, I've read some of the those books that you mentioned, and I think that's cool, and I don't necessarily disagree, but those aren't like the most compelling to me. Feel free to let us know or ask us any questions about that, because I think some of these are things that I don't hear people talking about, in my opinion, as much as they should be. I think that these are unbelievably compelling and unique aspects to Christianity that should be talked about more frequently. So, in summary, from a high level, there are two sides, I think, that make Christianity uniquely true. The first is the philosophical side, where the forgiveness, the reconciliation of sin, of that differential, I think is unique to Christianity and embodied in Jesus. And on a similar note, the emphasis on the unification of mind, spirit, and body in Christianity is something that I think is highly functional and as such compelling. From an experiential or experimental standpoint, there are a lot of different things that for me personally were compelling. Things like praying for those who persecute you, Jesus empathizing with our suffering, and tithing, staking our money, our treasure on that belief.
Well, and I think along with those, and something we've maybe talked about a little bit, is those things that you just outlined in the more personal realm of things, they're things that you've tried and have worked, right? And there's an aspect of truth where truth is that which works and is functional.
Yeah, I would say truth is in principle functional.
Right, because it's consistent with reality.
Yeah.
And so when something works and is effective, there's some level of truth there.
Yeah.
So when you have those highly effective things.
Yeah, when you have things that are highly functional, it speaks to some form of underlying truth behind it.
Right.
Well, with that, it's getting late. But recently, I've been thinking about fake leather. You know, we are seeing it more and more coming up in cars and in use. And I think a large portion of that is because kind of the more environmentally minded individuals are pushing for it. They don't want to see real leather being used in cars. But I actually think it might have a net negative effect, because at the end of the day, people are still eating meat. You know, we're still killing cows to get that meat, and there are hides. And those hides, whereas they would have been used before, they're not being used now, and instead it's being supplemented with, you know, these synthetics that need to be created, and oftentimes that means, you know, they're created with oils or with burning things, and it takes a lot of energy too. I kind of feel like this is similar to something I tweeted a little while back with chicken nuggets. You know, I asked the question, why do the same people who seem to have problems with chicken nuggets praise the Native Americans for using all parts of an animal? That's exactly what a chicken nugget does. It's using all parts of chickens. And in one case you say, oh, it's gross and that's terrible and I would never eat that. And in another case, you're praising it as some good positive thing. I kind of feel like we could say the same thing here, right? Like Native Americans used as much or all of the animals. They used their hides for clothes. They used bones for tools or weapons, and they ate the meat. And I feel like we should be doing the same kind of thing. It seems a little incongruent to have, you know, on one side advocating for the environment and saving things and praising Native Americans for using everything, and then on the other side advocating for fake leather and hating on chicken nuggets. I feel like you need to pick one or the other. For me, I'm all for using everything. I think chicken nuggets, have at it. I think that we should be using whatever leather we are pulling from animals. Use as much of it as possible. But that's just what I've been musing about recently. If you have any thoughts about what you find particularly compelling about Christianity, or fake leather, or chicken nuggets, feel free to send us an email at secondpartypodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. With that, thank you again for listening. Have a good night.